April 11th, 1945. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood on the west bank of the Elbe River with a pair of binoculars pressed to his face. He was staring east toward Berlin, 50 miles. That's how far his Ninth Army was from the German capital. 50 miles of mostly open highway with minimal German resistance. Simpson commanded 300,000 men, the most organized, best supplied American army in Europe. His forces had just crossed the Elbe at multiple points and established solid bridgeheads on the eastern bank. German units were surrendering by the thousands. They were throwing down their weapons and begging to be taken prisoner by the Americans before the Russians arrived. The Wehrmacht was finished as a fighting force. Simpson could see the opportunity. Berlin was right there. The road ahead wasn't blocked by tank traps or pillboxes. It was just asphalt. His men could literally drive to the capital without shifting gears. They could feel the end of the war in the air. 2 days of hard driving, and the American flag would be flying over the Reichstag. The war would be over. He picked up the field telephone and called General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Simpson's voice was urgent but controlled. "We can be in Berlin in 24 hours. Request permission to advance." There was a pause on the line. Bradley was checking with Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. Simpson waited, watching his soldiers consolidate their positions on the far side of the river. When Bradley came back on the line, his voice was flat. "The answer is no. Hold your position at the Elbe. No further advance toward Berlin." Simpson couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sir, we're 50 miles away. The road is open. German resistance is collapsing. We can take the capital and end this war." Bradley's response was firm. "Those are your orders, General. Halt at the Elbe. The Ninth Army will advance no further east." Simpson hung up the phone and stared across the river at the empty highway stretching toward Berlin. His army had just been told to stop, not to slow down, not to wait for supplies, to stop completely. Somewhere to the south, George Patton's Third Army was receiving the same order. They had fought their way across Germany in one of the most rapid advances in military history. They were closer to Berlin than anyone had imagined possible. And Eisenhower had just told them both to halt. To understand why this order felt like madness, you have to understand how fast the American armies had been moving. After breaking out from the Rhine River in March 1945, Allied forces swept across Germany with stunning speed. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Simpson's Ninth Army had covered over 200 miles in 3 weeks. They had bypassed German strongpoints, ignored their flanks, and driven straight east. It was mobile warfare at its finest. Patton's Third Army to the south had been equally aggressive. They had crossed the Rhine without permission, stolen supplies to keep moving, and advanced hundreds of miles into the German heartland. Every day brought them closer to ending the war. By early April, American forces were deep inside Germany. The Ruhr industrial region was surrounded. German armies were being cut off and captured by entire divisions. The Nazi war machine was collapsing. The path to Berlin was wide open. German commanders knew it. Hitler knew it. The soldiers on both sides knew it. The race was on to see who would get there first, the Americans from the west or the Soviets from the east. Simpson's soldiers could hear Soviet artillery in the distance. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the opposite direction, fighting their way through fanatical German resistance. The race was going to be close. On April 11th, Simpson's Ninth Army won. They reached the Elbe River first. They had beaten the Soviets to the final barrier before Berlin. All they needed was permission to cross and finish the job. Instead, they got an order to halt, and nobody could understand why. When George Patton received the halt order, his reaction was volcanic. He was 150 miles south of Simpson, driving his Third Army toward Czechoslovakia. But like Simpson, he could see the opportunity. Berlin was the target that mattered. Taking the German capital would break German morale completely. It would give the United States the symbolic victory that defined who won the war in Europe. It would put American forces in position to influence the post-war settlement. Patton had been arguing for weeks that the Allies should race for Berlin before the Soviets got there. He believed that whoever captured the capital would control the peace that followed. He was desperate to beat Stalin to the prize. Instead, Eisenhower was telling him to stop advancing east and turn south, to ignore Berlin and focus on capturing territory in southern Germany and Austria. It made no sense to Patton. "We're being stopped by politics," Patton told his staff officers. "Ike is more worried about keeping Stalin happy than winning the war decisively." He was right about politics being involved, but he didn't yet know the full reason for Eisenhower's decision. What Patton couldn't see from his headquarters was the intelligence briefings Eisenhower was receiving. Reports about a massive German fortress being constructed in the Alps, a redoubt where elite Nazi forces would make their last stand. These intelligence reports would shape everything that happened next. They would determine where American armies went and who captured Berlin. And they were almost completely wrong. The National Redoubt. That's what Allied intelligence was calling it. A massive fortress complex in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps where Nazi leadership planned to continue the war indefinitely. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had been tracking reports about the redoubt since late 1944. The intelligence painted a terrifying picture. Elite SS divisions withdrawing from the front to occupy prepared positions in the mountains. Underground factories producing weapons and ammunition. Food stockpiles for years of resistance. According to the intelligence reports, Hitler and his top commanders would retreat to this Alpine fortress when Berlin fell. From there, they would direct a guerrilla war that could last for years. The Wehrmacht would trade conventional warfare for mountain insurgency. Allied intelligence officers estimated that 200,000 to 300,000 German troops were being moved south to defend the redoubt. They reported that concrete fortifications were being built into mountainsides, that the Nazis were preparing for a fanatical last stand that would make the Italian campaign look easy. Eisenhower studied these reports carefully. He had fought the Germans for 3 years. He knew they were capable of fanatical resistance. The fighting in Italy had shown how effectively German forces could defend mountainous terrain. The Battle of the Bulge had proven they could still launch devastating counterattacks. The prospect of fighting in the Alps for another year or more was Eisenhower's nightmare. Every month the war continued meant more American casualties, more families receiving telegrams, more political pressure from a public that wanted their soldiers home. Berlin was a symbol. The Alpine Redoubt was a strategic threat. In Eisenhower's calculation, eliminating the redoubt mattered more than capturing the German capital, so he made his decision. American armies would not race for Berlin. They would turn south and destroy the National Redoubt before it became operational. They would crush the Nazi resistance in the Alps and end the war quickly and decisively. It was a reasonable decision based on the intelligence Eisenhower had. There was just one problem. The National Redoubt didn't exist. On April 12th, Eisenhower issued detailed orders to his army commanders. Bradley's 12th Army Group would halt at the Elbe. Simpson's 9th Army would advance no further toward Berlin. Patton's 3rd Army would turn south toward Austria and Bavaria. The mission was clear: locate and destroy the National Redoubt before German forces could complete their preparations. Capture Munich, Berchtesgaden, and the Alpine approaches. Prevent Hitler from establishing his mountain fortress. Patton read the orders with barely controlled rage. He was being sent on a wild goose chase while the real prize was 50 miles from Simpson's position. Every military instinct told him this was wrong. "We're going to regret this," Patton told General Omar Bradley. "Berlin matters. The capital is what counts. Let me take my army to Berlin and end this war." Bradley sympathized but had his own orders from Eisenhower. Patton had no choice. He turned his 3rd Army south. His divisions that had been racing east toward Czechoslovakia and potentially Berlin now pivoted toward Munich and the Austrian border. The most aggressive army in Europe was being redirected away from the enemy's capital. To be fair to Eisenhower, he wasn't just following bad intelligence. He was also following political agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed on occupation zones for Germany. Berlin would be in the Soviet zone regardless of who captured it. Allied planners had drawn lines on maps dividing Germany into American, British, and Soviet sectors. These zones were supposed to govern post-war occupation. Berlin sat deep inside the Soviet zone, over 100 miles east of where the occupation boundaries would be. Some of Eisenhower's staff argued this made racing for Berlin pointless. Why lose American lives capturing a city they would have to hand over to the Soviets anyway? Why antagonize Stalin by violating the occupation agreements? But Patton and other commanders saw it differently. Capturing Berlin would give the United States negotiating leverage. It would demonstrate American military capability. It would allow American forces to see what was happening in Eastern Europe before Soviet occupation became total. The debate didn't matter. Eisenhower had made his decision. American armies would hunt the ghost fortress in the Alps, while the Soviets took Berlin. For the soldiers of Simpson's 9th Army, the halt order was incomprehensible. They sat on the banks of the Elbe River, cleaning their weapons, writing letters home, and watching the highway that led to Berlin. German refugees streamed past American positions, fleeing east to west. They were running from the Red Army, desperate to reach American lines before the Soviets caught them. Their stories were terrifying. American soldiers heard reports of systematic crimes against women, looting, and summary executions. The refugees described Soviet soldiers as liberators in name only. They said the Red Army was taking revenge for German atrocities in Russia, and civilians were paying the price. One American lieutenant wrote home to his wife, "We're 50 miles from Berlin. We could be there in 2 days. Instead, we're sitting on this river watching German civilians run from the Russians. The men are asking why we're not advancing. I don't have an answer." It was a surreal contrast. On the West Bank, American soldiers sat in relative quiet, cleaning weapons and brewing coffee. On the East Bank, they could hear the distant screams of refugees and the rumble of Soviet artillery. The sounds of desperation carried across the water, while American forces waited for orders that never came. The frustration was universal. Soldiers who had fought across France, through the Battle of the Bulge, across the Rhine, and deep into Germany, couldn't understand why they were being stopped with victory so close. They had momentum. They had supplies. They had beaten the German army. Why stop now? Some units sent reconnaissance patrols across the Elbe toward Berlin, testing whether the orders might change. Simpson allowed limited patrols, but was clear that no major advance would happen without permission from Eisenhower. That permission never came. Instead, American forces watched the horizon light up at night. Soviet artillery was pounding German positions around Berlin. The final battle for the German capital was beginning, and the United States Army was sitting on the sidelines 50 miles away. The soldiers could hear the guns. They could see the smoke rising in the distance. They knew that history was being made just beyond the horizon, and they had been ordered not to participate. Private James Anderson of the 83rd Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "Today we heard that the Russians have started their attack on Berlin. We're close enough to hear their artillery. Every man in the company is asking the same question. Why aren't we moving?" The answer was in the Alps, where Patton's Third Army was searching for a fortress that didn't exist. April 16th, 1945. Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the Soviet assault on Berlin. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces began the final attack. It was the largest military operation in European history. The bombardment was apocalyptic. Soviet artillery fired over 500,000 shells in the first 30 minutes. Entire neighborhoods of Berlin disappeared in fire and smoke. The ground shook from the bombardment miles away from the impact zone. German defenders fought with desperate fanaticism. They knew what Soviet occupation would mean. Hitler had issued orders for total defense of the capital. Every street would be contested. Every building would be a fortress. Berlin would not fall easily. From the Elbe River, American soldiers could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The battle was happening just beyond the horizon. Simpson's troops listened to the guns and wondered why they weren't involved. They had reached Berlin's doorstep first. Now they were spectators. The Soviets were paying an enormous price for the city. German defenders were using Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets, to destroy Soviet tanks in close-quarters street fighting. Every block cost lives. Every building was a battleground. The Red Army was taking casualties at rates that American commanders considered unacceptable. But Stalin wanted Berlin. The Soviet dictator had ordered Zhukov to capture the city before the Americans could get there. Stalin understood that whoever took Berlin would be seen as the conqueror of Nazi Germany. The symbolic value was worth any price. By April 25th, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin completely. The encirclement was total. Any German units still in the city were trapped. The end was inevitable. It was just a question of how long the Germans would hold out, and how many more would die. American reconnaissance units reported back to Simpson's headquarters. Soviet forces were now between the Elbe and Berlin. Even if Simpson received permission to advance, the opportunity had passed. The Soviets had claimed the prize. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces made their first official contact at Torgau on the Elbe River. The meeting was supposed to be a celebration, an historic moment when the armies that had crushed Nazi Germany from east and west finally met in the middle. The reality was more complicated. The photographs from Torgau show smiling soldiers, handshakes, and vodka toasts. American and Soviet troops embracing as allies who had defeated Hitler together. The images were sent around the world as proof that the Grand Alliance had triumphed. Behind the smiles, American officers were having a different experience. They were seeing the Red Army up close for the first time. What they saw disturbed them deeply. Soviet soldiers were looting systematically. They took watches from German civilians at gunpoint. They confiscated food, clothing, anything of value. American officers watched Soviet troops strip entire villages of movable property and ship it east. The treatment of German women was worse. American commanders received reports from German civilians describing systematic crimes against women by Soviet troops. The scale was beyond anything American forces had witnessed in their advance across Germany. It wasn't combat misconduct. It was systematic. Captain John Thompson of the 69th Infantry Division wrote in his report, "The Soviet soldiers seemed to view Germany as conquered territory where normal rules don't apply. Their officers make no effort to control their behavior. The German civilians are terrified of them." At the official meeting, American and Soviet commanders exchanged pleasantries through translators. They praised each other's armies and toasted victory over fascism. The photographs captured this diplomatic surface. They didn't capture what American soldiers were thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Gardner spoke with a Soviet colonel about the advance on Berlin. The Soviet officer was matter-of-fact about casualties. "We lost perhaps 80,000 men taking the city, but we took it. That's what matters." The number shocked Gardner. 80,000 dead for a city that German resistance couldn't have held for more than a few weeks. Gardner did the math. If Simpson's 9th Army had advanced to Berlin from the Elbe, they would have faced minimal German resistance. The Wehrmacht was finished. Most German units were trying to surrender to the Americans to avoid Soviet capture. American casualties would have been a fraction of Soviet losses, but the decision had been made. Berlin belonged to the Soviets. The Iron Curtain was already forming, though nobody was using that term yet. The line where American forces stopped would become the border between East and West for the next 45 years. Back at American positions along the Elbe, soldiers watched Soviet forces consolidate their control. They watched the Red Army move into position. They watched the future taking shape. And they began to wonder if they had stopped at the wrong river. While Simpson's army sat on the Elbe and Berlin burned, Patton's Third Army was hunting for the National Redoubt. They advanced into Bavaria and Austria, searching for the fortress that Allied intelligence had warned about. Patton's soldiers drove into the Alpine foothills, expecting to encounter prepared German defenses. They anticipated having to fight their way through mountain positions manned by elite SS troops. They were ready for the final desperate battle of the European War. Instead, they found minimal resistance. German units were surrendering almost immediately. Officers were ordering their men to lay down weapons rather than fight to the death. There was no fanatical defense, no fortress, no last stand. The Third Army captured Munich on April 30th. Hitler's birthplace of the Nazi Party fell without significant resistance. German soldiers were literally lining up to surrender to American forces. They wanted to be captured by Americans rather than Russians. Patton's intelligence officers searched for evidence of the National Redoubt. They interrogated German prisoners about the Alpine fortress. They examined captured documents looking for references to the mountain redoubt plans. They inspected the terrain looking for fortifications. They found nothing. Patton expected a fortress of fire and steel. Instead, he found a ghost town. The birds were singing in the Alps. The only sound was the crunch of American boots on gravel. No artillery, no bunkers. Just the wind blowing through the trees where the great National Redoubt was supposed to be. No underground factories. No massive supply depots. No concrete bunkers built into mountainsides. The National Redoubt was a myth. On May 5th, Patton's forces reached Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat. This was supposed to be the heart of the National Redoubt. The Eagle's Nest should have been the command center for the final defense. Instead, it was lightly defended and fell in a matter of hours. American soldiers walked through Hitler's compound taking souvenirs. There were no preparations for extended resistance, no stored weapons or ammunition, no facilities to house thousands of troops. Berchtesgaden was a vacation home, not a fortress. The truth hit immediately. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, had played the Allies perfectly. He had spread rumors about an Alpine fortress, knowing the Americans feared a prolonged guerrilla war. He fed them coded radio broadcasts, planted documents mentioning troop movements south, encouraged civilian rumors about underground factories. None of it was real, but all of it was plausible enough to be believed. British intelligence had been skeptical, but American intelligence was certain, and Eisenhower had made strategic decisions based on a lie. Patton immediately contacted Bradley. The redoubt doesn't exist. It was a deception. We've been chasing a phantom while the Soviets took Berlin. Bradley acknowledged the report, but there was nothing to be done. The decisions had been made. Berlin had fallen. The opportunity was gone. Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice on May 8th. "We have been had. The National Redoubt was German propaganda, and we fell for it. We should have taken Berlin when we had the chance. Now we're going to pay for this mistake for the next 50 years. He was right." Berlin fell to the Soviets on May 2nd, 1945. Hitler had taken his own life in his bunker 2 days earlier. The remaining German defenders surrendered to Marshal Zhukov's forces. The Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. The cost was staggering. Soviet casualties exceeded 80,000 killed and over 280,000 wounded. German casualties were even higher. The city was destroyed. The battle had been brutal beyond description. From the Elbe River, American soldiers had listened to the artillery thunder for weeks. They had watched Soviet forces storm the city. They could have reached in 2 days. They wondered why they weren't advancing. They questioned orders that kept them from finishing what they'd started. The question would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Could they have taken Berlin with fewer casualties? Would German defenders have surrendered to Americans rather than fight to the death against the Soviets? Would American occupation of the capital have changed the post-war settlement? The answers remain unknowable. But the consequences of stopping at the Elbe became clear within weeks. Within weeks of German surrender, the nature of Soviet occupation became undeniable. The Red Army wasn't liberating Eastern Europe, it was conquering it. In Poland, the Soviets arrested resistance leaders who had fought the Nazis for 6 years. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, Soviet military occupation enabled communist parties to seize control. The pattern was universal. Wherever the Red Army stopped in May 1945 became the permanent border of Soviet control. The occupation zones agreed at Yalta were supposed to be temporary. Instead, they became the Iron Curtain. General Simpson, whose Ninth Army had been halted 50 miles from Berlin, wrote in his private papers years later, "We stopped at the Elbe to avoid confrontation with the Russians. Now I wonder if confrontation in April would have been preferable to what followed." The line where American armies stopped became the border between freedom and Soviet domination, between democracy and totalitarian control. For 45 years, that line divided Europe. Over 100 million people lived under communist rule behind it. The Cold War that Eisenhower tried to avoid by respecting Soviet occupation rights happened anyway. It just lasted half a century. And it began exactly where American armies stopped at the Elbe River. On May 7th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, George Patton met with Dwight Eisenhower in Frankfurt. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers were celebrating in the streets. But Patton wasn't celebrating. He had come to tell Eisenhower something that would end their friendship, something that would get him removed from command within months, something that history would vindicate. He told Eisenhower that the United States should immediately attack the Soviet Union, that the Red Army was exhausted and vulnerable, that American forces were at peak strength, that if confrontation with the Soviets was inevitable, May 1945 was the moment to act. Eisenhower rejected the proposal immediately. The American public wanted peace. Congress was demanding demobilization. President Truman was trying to build cooperative relationships with Stalin. The idea was politically impossible. Patton spent the next months trying to convince anyone who would listen. He documented Soviet brutality. He warned about communist expansion. He predicted that Eastern Europe would disappear behind Soviet control, and that the confrontation Eisenhower avoided would happen anyway over decades instead of months. On September 22, 1945, Patton made inflammatory comments at a press conference comparing Nazi Party membership to American political parties. The backlash was immediate. By October, Eisenhower had relieved him of command of Third Army. Patton was given a desk job writing the history of the European campaign. On December 9, 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was paralyzed from the neck down and died 12 days later in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside soldiers of the Third Army. Everything Patton predicted came true. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, communist expansion globally, the Iron Curtain that divided the continent for 45 years, the Cold War that cost trillions of dollars and millions of lives in proxy conflicts around the world. The question remains whether his solution would have worked, whether attacking the Soviet Union in May 1945 would have prevented communist domination of Eastern Europe or started World War III, whether advancing from the Elbe to Berlin would have given America negotiating leverage or fractured the Grand Alliance. These questions are unanswerable with certainty. But the decision made at the Elbe River in April 1945 shaped the next half-century of history. The line where Simpson's army stopped became the Iron Curtain. The intelligence failure about a ghost fortress in the Alps redirected American strategy at the most critical moment. 50 miles from Berlin, American soldiers stood on a riverbank and watched the future being decided. They wondered why they weren't advancing. They questioned orders that seemed to contradict everything they'd fought for. And decades later, historians would wonder the same thing. The Elbe halt stands as a case study in the consequences of choosing diplomatic caution over military opportunity, of trusting intelligence assessments over operational commanders' instincts, of respecting political agreements when strategic circumstances change. Whether those choices were right or wrong depends on what you think mattered more: avoiding confrontation with Stalin in 1945, or preventing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe for 45 years. The debate continues.